We've got a powerful duo to start off today's interviews. In the studio right here, please welcome Priya Parker, an acclaimed author of Art of Gathering, as well as the executive producer and host of the New York Times podcast, Together Apart. And Baratunde Thurston, an Emmy-nominated host and communicator who has worked for The Onion, produced for The Daily Show, and is the author of the New York bestseller, How to Be Black. They will be giving the keynote at 12:30 today in the Ballroom D at the Austin Convention Center. We are thrilled to have you guys here today. So, Priya, Baratunde, welcome to the studio.
Hello, Carrie. Thank you for having us. We're thrilled too.
Thrilled to be here.
All right, so I've got some great questions for you. You are both experts on community and connection. Two people who spend a lot of time listening to others. What's the pulse of our community these days, right now? Let's just start off with an easy one.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that captured some of the pulse, like the awkward stare.
Totally. Are we fist bumping? Are we
Exactly.
elbow?
Mouths are new to a lot of us. Just
facial cues are back.
Facial cues, exactly. It's like we can smize, but it's like, oh, you can see the bottom half of my mouth sometimes.
Yeah.
I mean, I think, communities, nothing is a monolith. And so people are having many, many different realities right now. And I think, at least in my experience in watching kind of what's happening, is some communities are re-entering the, I think, meat space. Is that the
IRL?
IRL.
Yes.
We have been through many world-changing events in the last 2 years.
And in the last week.
Yep.
And we have changed, and the world has changed. And I think people are hopeful, exhausted, angry.
Definitely, all those things. I mean, I'll jump in there and just say, we're stretched.
We're stretched.
I think a lot of us are broken to some degree, just like we can't take another one. There's people still recovering from forest fires in the US. And then there's emotional fires on top of that. And then there's what's happening in Ukraine. And so how to manage all that, and also resetting and restarting. Some people left their jobs and are really thrilled about that. Kids are back in school. Parents I know are really thrilled about that. And the society reopening to a large degree brings a lot of joy and renewal. So the pulse is mixed, from everything I can see. There's no single answer to that question. A lot.
A lot.
A lot.
I mean, this isn't really community, but I saw a tweet the other day that was like, in the East Coast this summer, there's going to be like 6-inch spiders falling from the sky, coming onto the trees. And someone texted me, it's like, feels a little aggressive.
Wait, are they jealous of the murder hornets?
Yeah.
Like what?
Yeah, what happened to the bees?
Yeah.
Weren't the bees coming?
It's almost like some of the stories we hear aren't exactly as we hear them.
What? Misinformation?
I know, it's possible.
On the internet?
No, you're right. That's ridiculous.
So the pandemic has created and exacerbated a lot of division in our country. How can we start to heal those divides, both from a macro level and a one-on-one perspective?
You are coming with the easy questions right now.
I know, I thought it's the morning, we've had our coffee,
Warming up.
Bring it.
I mean, I think that starting local, right? Starting with actually the people that you know and the communities that you're in. No community is a monolith, right? We think there's this radio host and journalist, Krista Tippett, and she says, we assume a monolith in the other that we know not to be true in our own side, right? The Christians or the South Asians or the Presbyterians, and one knows in one's own family, there's a lot of difference even within one's own.
Yeah, the Rams fans. Not a monolith.
Not a monolith.
Yeah.
I don't know enough sports to be like the difference within the Rams fans. But I think part of healing, I'm a conflict resolution facilitator, and often when I'm brought into a community or an organization, the first question is, how do we heal? And the first thing I ask back is, well, two things. One, what happened? What do you think happened? And to just start with that question and listen to what people's answers are, because there's a lot of different stories of what actually happened. And then the next question is, what is the need here? And so quickly we get into how do we heal, how do we heal? But healing, you need to make sure that you're basically, like, that the surgery worked.
Yeah, and that you agree on the injury.
Yeah.
Yes.
Right? We don't go straight into the surgery room, the operating room. We get diagnosed.
Beautiful.
And all those medical professionals agree, oh, your spleen is out of whack, this bone is broken. But if you got 3 different surgeons trying to fix 3 different things, none of which is actually wrong, that's not healing. That's a lot of activity, could be harmful. At best, it does no good. Yeah.
I'll give a specific example just to kind of ground it a little bit. I was speaking a few months ago with someone emailed me, and basically, and I have permission to share this story. She's part of a small church in North Carolina, and she wrote me and she said, you know, after 2 years, we've been doing a lot of missing of each other. We haven't physically worshiped together, right? We literally miss each other.
Yeah.
The racial uprising revealed a lot of fissures within the community that some people didn't realize were there before, and we're doing a lot of missing of each other, like down to the question of what does it mean to be a Christian. And it's a very, very fraught moment. And they were trying to figure out, like, what do we do? Do we bring people together? Do we talk about it? Do we just go worship together in the same ways? And they diagnosed, and she said, part of what we realized we needed to kind of grow the desire to water the bed of our community to even want to come together.
Yeah.
And so they threw a parking lot party. And it was super simple, right? It's literally in the backyard, the back parking lot of a church. And she convinced her kind of community to rent a dunk tank. And part of gathering, which is my expertise, is like you need to know what the diagnostic is before you know what the form is. And she basically wrote, like, on a text message to her team, we need to basically have fun. We need to remember. We need to grow our love. We need to play in order to have the conversation.
Yeah.
And therefore, we should spend this $200 to rent the dunk tank for Dunk the Deacon. You know, it's kind of facetious, but part of it is like, because you have to grow the love. You have to remember, why are we actually, coming together in this community, and some amount of shared, like, experience and spectacle. And they did this, and part of what it wasn't escape. It was actually watering the bed to re-engage. And part of, I think, in a community is like, what community are we talking about, right? What communities are we a part of? And then how and where do we begin to ask, like, what is the need here?
I love that story.
So
and I love the idea of dunking anyone in authority. So most people will love that, except maybe the authority figure. But if they're truly a servant to the people,
Exactly,
they'll
they're
they'll enjoy it too. I've been working on this podcast for a while, How to Citizen, and the idea of citizening as a verb, which you just reminded me of in terms of practicing, right? Practicing love. We have to come up with an activity. We have to do something to remind ourselves that we're invested in each other. Practice caring. And when you do that, you might actually end up caring. There is a really great tech platform called Majal, M-A-J-A-L, out of the Middle East. It's for LGBTQ plus people. And they have a slow onboarding of new users. It's not like our Twitter and our Facebook, where from day one, you can show up in somebody's DMs and tag people and all that. You have to basically practice joining that community over time. So the cost of trolling is very high. And for 8 or 9 months, you have to pretend to be a good person before you could actually do dirt. By the end of that,
The trolls are like, this is exhausting.
right?
I'm
You
out.
either don't want to do it,
Yeah.
or you're a good person. And not that there are good or bad people, but you're a more constructive member of the community because you had to practice being a member of the community and not just spouting off. And I think a lot of the communities that I'm a part of and that I witness, we are encouraged to spout off. We're encouraged to yell and speak and agitate, but not to engage with each other.
Right.
And so we have a lot of practice at one muscle, and we've atrophied this other curiosity and community building muscle.
Practice joy and bringing joy to others seems like something that would really heal right now, for sure.
Yeah.
Do you think we've learned any lessons about connection and community during the pandemic? And if so, do you see us heeding those lessons, or do you fear we will quickly head back to the old ways?
Oh, I mean,
Have we learned?
we learn and we forget.
Yeah.
I'm 44 now. I've been through a couple of cycles of lessons learned and lessons forgotten. After 9/11, we learned many lessons. It was the end of irony. We were going to be compassionate. We were going to not discriminate against people based on their religion because we knew it was too simplistic to say Islam attacked us. And yet, years later, we had a president who tried to ban a whole group of religious practitioners from the nation just for their religious practice.
Right.
So we learn and we unlearn. And I used to be very devastated by that, because like, we're never gonna move forward. But I think it's a pendulum, and we swing. We've learned some lessons like parents need healthcare, and childcare, because these kids are out here taking up a lot of energy in ways that a lot of parents didn't expect or plan for, and that our society didn't cover. So we have to are we gonna do something about that? Will we learn that? The jury's still out. I think we can, but I also know that we can forget.
Like anything, it needs practice, right? You have to practice everything you
Yeah.
get good at. You got to practice guitar if you want to play guitar.
Yeah.
You got to practice being a good person.
But I think part of what the 9/11 corollary is really interesting, because at some level there were certain institutions and there were certain systems that were put in place that we still have today, right? Both
TSA, Homeland Security.
You still got to take your shoes off, right?
Even though that's theatrical.
Yeah, exactly.
Right.
And so I think part of, like, in any type, like World War I, World War II particularly, was like a massive rupture in which our norms temporarily changed. Women went to the workforce in massive numbers that fundamentally shifted not just who was in the workforce, but our assumptions of who can work, right? Who's worthy of work when people came back. And I think similarly with the pandemic, these past 2 years, some individuals forget, but systems kind of last. And so at some level, part of the question here is not just individual practice, but what are the systems, what are the institutions, what's the legislation that's being passed? Because there's an opening and because we actually saw, oh, if my healthcare is tied to my job, that I'm not gonna quit and start the company I've always wanted to start because I'm stuck. Or, oh, parental leave is incredibly important. Oh, and so I think part of this is individual practice, but also we're in a political and institutional moment where windows are open, and so whatever you can kind of push through can last.
And I remember those early hopeful days when we saw emissions decline and coyotes took over our streets like I Am Legend.
Yes.
It was beautiful. Like, there's a bear in my backyard. Is that beautiful? But yeah, it's kind of cool. And the collective action that we're capable of. We saw the government spit out a ton of money like that. This government, this U.S. government, so divided, came together to try to stop some of this metaphorical bleeding. Will we continue to come together to rally for the larger climate crisis? Can we acknowledge that that's something that needs to be healed, that that's a shared diagnostic of the problem, to continue to use our energy collectively in that way? I really hope so.
Can I just say, if there was like a title, at least so far of our conversation, aiming towards a shared diagnostic of the problem would be a revolutionary act.
Yeah, and then we could return to levels of comfortable fighting about how to resolve it. But I think it is tricky and harmful and challenging to be on such different pages about what's wrong, because then you're missing each other, in many ways.
Can you two run for government? Maybe just be the counselors for the country. That would be great.
It's kind of fun.
We'd have to get I don't know, new outfits? Or?
Definitely new outfits. Definitely new outfits. A uniform.
You don't
Matching
need a new outfit.
we got, hey,
we did not plan this.
We didn't plan this. We have the whole spectrum.
Yes.
So what is your hope for the coming year? And as we enter this transitional reopening period, what are your personal goals for the reopening? Do you want me to just ask what you're wearing? Who are you wearing?
Exactly, it's the right question. Just ask the question again.
Okay, so what are your personal goals for the reopening, and what is your hope for the transitional period that we're in right now?
Personal goals for reopening. I lived an extraordinarily high-speed, high-burn life before COVID. Lots of flying. I used to be proud of how little sleep, how many miles. I don't want to go fully back to that. I hope that as I return, I remain more measured and considerate about what's worth getting on a plane for, and more broadly, how I'm going to expend my energy. I revel in some of the quietness, and I learned a lot from just making time with myself. So I hope to preserve time with myself and with my partner. And just, we got a lot of quality time to invest in each other, and I want to keep that going as we return, and not just snap back to the old habits. That would be too much forgetting.
I read a book over the pandemic called Social Chemistry, and it's by a professor of management at Yale. And one of the things that she writes about in that book is, and it was early pandemic days, and it was like map out who you long for. And in part because you don't bump into, during the pandemic, you don't bump into friends of friends of friends, right?
Yeah.
Which I miss, right? You don't have the spontaneous interaction. And I paused and I thought and I wrote down, and it was a beautiful question, like, who do I long for? Like, who do I want to kind of throw that fishing like rod out? Are you following my metaphor and reeling in?
Yeah.
And I wrote down, a handful of names. And first of all, just noticing like, oh, like where is there actually desire? Where is there longing? Where is there like a deep, almost like energetic, like open door, open channel, intentional connection.
Intentional, yeah, not just the happenstance.
And in part because you had to make an effort. Like over the last couple of years, I have like practices of like virtual teas with like certain people because I knew I wasn't going to run into them. And I think, and I'm really welcoming kind of coming back to the public square and running into people. And one of my favorite tweets during the pandemic was from a woman, I think she writes for The Atlantic, and she said, I don't just miss my friends. I don't just miss my friends' friends. I miss my friends' friends' friends. The kind of people you run into once or twice a year because you share common friends and you're so happy to catch up. I think there's a beauty in kind of, and I know we're not fully reopening and who knows what's going to happen next month, but there's a beauty in kind of bringing the world back in and going out into the public square. And I hope for myself, I also keep those like strong fishing rods even when one doesn't have to.
Intention and spontaneity.
Yeah.
I love that.
That's a wonderful way to answer the question. Thank you. We focus a lot on the economic and social impacts of the pandemic. Do you think we focus enough on grief and loss, which sometimes can be hidden?
No, we don't. I did a lot of virtual speaking during the pandemic, and I would always open these talks, and still do, with just an acknowledgement of loss, grief, rage even. I mean, the emotional toll that this time has taken on so many of us, and I would just like let people have a moment. If you're feeling this, that, the other thing, you're normal. The world's crazy, you're normal. And so, a credit to President Biden, who has continuously tried to recenter the grief and the loss, not just every number, 960,000 people or so as we sit in this country at this time who we know have died of COVID, probably more, and a lot of other people that we miss because they passed on for other reasons. As a descendant of people who've experienced a lot of trauma and grief, I can speak to the pain of not acknowledging that. And so I hope for us all a collective like mourning ceremony of some kind. Maybe you could help out with that, the Queen of Gathering here. But I think it's important to process those feelings, otherwise they do come out sideways and they can inflict more pain. Yeah.
And I deeply agree with that. And I think like there's kind of two different levels of grief. There's individual grief, right, to begin to process oneself, but there's also this idea of collective grief.
Yeah.
And practitioners like Jack Saul and Amy Cunningham, they are people who really deeply think about not just individual ritual, but collective rituals, when one doesn't necessarily have like a name for the thing that one has lost, but how does one actually process it? And when I wrote this book, The Art of Gathering, 4 years ago, and part of what I did at that time was I interviewed different people who other people credited with creating transformative experiences, group experiences. And one of the people I spoke with was a funeral director named Amy Cunningham. And she's based in Brooklyn, New York. And she said, this was pre-pandemic, but she said, there's a trend in the US where people don't want funerals anymore. They want celebrations.
Yeah.
And she said, and this is a dangerous trend.
Happy endings in America. That's what we do.
And I said, why is it dangerous? And she said, because when we do not grieve, we cannot be transformed by our grief.
Yeah.
And so, like in this moment, and I think it's also complicated because we've been here before where we think, we're opening back up, and then there's like another variant or so. I say all of this with an asterisk, but when we do not collectively process in our institutions, in our hospitals, like healthcare workers are exhausted and they're also full of grief. I mean, in speaking with them, what are some of the designed collective rituals that we can pause and actually not just reflect, but be transformed, mourn, right? The loss of more than 1 million lives, mourn the loss of a way of life.
Yeah, loss
So
of
that we can
ritual.
then begin to ask, it's like, and the metaphor that she said is like when you mourn, when you grieve at a funeral, and then you begin to exit and go back out into the sunlight, you're able to take the transformation of that grief and ask, well, how might we re-enter?
Yeah.
Wow, that's beautiful. What are important messages for kids and students that they need to hear these days, and how do we explain the unexplainable to them?
I think this is an incredibly important question. And I'm a parent, and I think of this for my children, and in speaking with other teachers, I think there's kind of two different parts of helping children through the world we live in right now. I think one is social and emotional skills, and very, very simply beginning by practicing just naming feelings and making them okay. Brene Brown recently came out with an atlas of human emotions. It's called Atlas of the Heart. And it's actually an incredibly beautiful, kind of precise diagnostic of 80 different emotions.
80?
Yeah.
No.
Maybe 90. And even as an individual, as a
I'm
parent.
emotionally illiterate.
Right? It's like, what's the difference between joy and happiness? What's the distinction between rage and anger? What's the difference? And it's like so one is beginning both as when we don't have the language and we aren't good at diagnosing and practice at diagnosing our emotions, to help our children do that. But the second track is content. How does one talk about Russia and Ukraine? What is the language one uses at an age appropriate? Racial uprising, and how to actually develop a culturally fluent anti-racist family. As a parent, as an adult, when one doesn't have one's language and hasn't done one's own process, how does one even begin to equip one's children? And so one is how to social and emotional, start with feelings and help children practice just naming and not judging what they're feeling.
Yeah.
In part because when you name it, it starts to lessen. And then the other part is content-wise, how do we begin to find age-appropriate language that explains and creates a collective shared diagnostic of what the actual problem is? And these are lifelong practices.
Yep.
Yeah,
That's
collective shared
so
diagnostic.
dope. The only thing I would add, and especially on the racial uprising front and how we help kids move through that there's essentially, it's okay to not know.
Yeah.
I think a lot of us feel pressure to say the right thing and be the right way and take the exact right actions, like we're all running for office.
Yeah.
Like we're all having little press releases and being on, like we're all Jen Psaki.
Yeah.
And we're not. And
But we would like to be.
we would. She is
she's
pretty dope.
amazing.
But we know we can't be because she is already Jen Psaki.
Exactly.
So in the absence of infinite Psakis, we have to be ourselves. And I know that a lot of kids I've encountered feel pressure and fear around making mistakes, around saying the wrong thing, around not knowing. Not knowing is a great opportunity.
Right.
And if we can celebrate, not ignorance, not willful ignorance, but curiosity in the face of lack of knowledge, then we give permission for people to not know. And that opens up some learning possibilities that are not there when the shame of not knowing is too much pressure in the other direction.
Can I say one more just practical tip that has helped me
Yes.
as a parent? There's a financial journalist named Ron Lieber. He has written many incredibly helpful books about financial literacy that I love. The Opposite of Spoiled is one of them, which is really good. And one of the things he says, this is specifically around money and how do you raise children to have healthy relationships with money?
Don't give them any.
Exactly.
Gotta earn your own, kid. Get a job.
Well, in part because our mental models of what we think about money, when we unexamined, we just pass down implicitly. And his biggest tip, and I've started doing this and it really helps, is a kid asks you a question, and I think the instinct, as you said, is like to have an answer.
Yeah.
And okay, here's the magic question.
Yeah.
The magic answer. To respond, what makes you ask that?
Oh, that's good.
Changes literally everything.
Yeah.
Because usually what makes them ask that is not your thousands of reasons why you think they asked that, or your thousand fears. And he's like, oh, well, I was just curious about why it was colored copper. It's like, oh.
So you're not asking about Fed monetary policy?
Yeah.
Thank goodness, because I was going to be on Wikipedia right quick and whatever Google gave me first.
Completely. What makes you ask that?
Thank you two so much for being here. I am very excited for your keynote today, and it has been just an honor speaking with you. I could ask you 1,000 more questions.
Thank you
And
so
we
much.
could
The
say,
hard ones
what
were there
makes
to
you
come.
ask that?
Oh, I see what you did there.
Lovely. Okay, so thank you both for being here. I'm your host, Carrie Byron, and we will be back with more exclusive interviews from the South by Southwest EDU studio. You can see the complete interview schedule at southbysouthwestedu.com/studio. And you can find all of our studio interviews on the South by Southwest EDU TV app, available on Apple TV, Roku, Android TV, and Amazon Fire.